story. It's a story about 6 people who died violently in Germany in 1922. It's a story about an investigation that went on for decades, but never identified the perpetrator. It's a story that has become a legend. I want you to come with me into history, into the long, cold dark. This is Long, Cold Dark, the story of the murders at Hinterkaifeck. In this episode, we'll go through a timeline of the days immediately following the discovery of the murders. As ever, we're working with incomplete records. The information that follows is as accurate as I can make it. You should know that I built a scale model of the crime scene. You can find images of it in the show notes. They'll help you understand the layout of the farm and the locations of the people moving through the scene. This episode contains descriptions of violence and violence against children. Listener discretion is advised. April 5th, 1922, Wednesday. Munich police and 2 dog handlers, led by Inspector George Reingruber, investigated the murders. They were called to Weidhofen in the evening hours of April 4th, but they didn't arrive until about 1:30 a.m. Rather than attempt to begin their investigation in the dead of night, they put up in a room provided by Mayor Gregor, and they arrived at the crime scene between 5:30 and 6 a.m. on April 5th. Reingruber spent a single day at Hinterkaifeck. He led the initial crime scene investigation on April 5th and returned to Munich in the evening. He would never return to Hinterkaifeck, but he remained the lead investigator on the case until January of 1930. The investigators were met at the farm by Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who showed them around, described the discovery of the bodies, and identified the victims. They followed the same path from the barn through the house that Schlittenbauer had followed on April 4th. During the tour, Schlittenbauer found what he described as a place in the stable near where the bodies were found, where a shovel-deep hole had been dug. The excavation was fresh and covered with straw. He told police that he believed the killer or killers tried to dig a hole to bury the bodies, but the ground was frozen. Reingruber made particular note of Schlittenbauer's demeanor during this time. I'm going to quote from his notes at length. He talked a lot and made himself important. He took care of everything and was also very familiar with the domestic circumstances of the murdered. Schlittenbauer's excitement can perhaps be explained by the fact that among the murdered was his own child, the 2.5-year-old Joseph Gruber. Reingruber's report goes on to summarize Schlittenbauer's relationship with Victoria, before noting that Schlittenbauer appeared to have no motive for murder. Meanwhile, the police dogs, Flora and Argus, were deployed in the stable and courtyard. The dogs were apparently unable to pick up any useful scent. Andreas Schweiger recalled in 1980 that the dogs sniffed at his shoes, which were covered in blood from walking around the crime scene, and they pawed at hay in the stable, but they didn't do much else. The dogs' failure was attributed to the fact that the murders had gone undiscovered for at least 4 days, and fresh snow had fallen in the meantime. By the time the dogs arrived from Munich, there was very little scent evidence for them to track. Then, as now, investigators set out to interview witnesses, the men who found the bodies, neighbors, associates, and anyone who may have had information about the murders. Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel, the 2 men who had accompanied Lorenz Schlittenbauer to Hinterkaifeck, described finding all the barn and house doors locked and breaking into the stable on April 4th. Mayor George Gregor could offer little information beyond a timeline for the discovery of the bodies, and some sketchy information about the Gruber family's social dealings. Most other witnesses were able to offer very little information about the family. Their general seclusion and avoidance of other people meant that very little was known about their day-to-day lives. Even Andreas' brother, Bernard, told police that he had no knowledge of any potential valuables in the house, or of Andreas' business dealings. The Grubers' isolation served to stymie any line of inquiry into the missing items. As nothing could be proven to be missing from the house, nothing could be traced. This vexed the issue of motive. Some money, jewelry, and other valuables were still in the house. In addition to small stashes of cash and coins, investigators found gold and silver coins valued at several thousand marks in a tin can in a cupboard that was blocked by sacks of grain. Despite this, local and regional newspaper reporters speculated that robbery was the primary motive, as it was impossible to be certain what, if anything, was missing. The time of the murders was fixed at some point between the evening of March 31st and April 1st. This was based on a number of findings at the crime scene. Andreas was dressed only in an undershirt and trousers, as if he had been preparing for bed when he was murdered. Celie was already in her nightclothes. Joseph was in his carriage, where he was generally placed to sleep. Victoria was fully clothed, but wore no shoes. Cecilia Gruber and Maria Baumgartner were fully clothed. The tear-off calendar in the farmhouse had not yet been turned to April 1st. Celie was absent from school on Saturday, April 1st, and Monday, April 3rd, and the family did not attend church on Sunday, April 2nd. No one reported seeing any member of the household after the early evening of March 31st. Court physician Johann Baptist Aumüller took over examination of the Grubers' bodies. He had the corpses moved into the Hinterkaifeck courtyard, where there was better light, and that's where he autopsied them. Aumüller determined that a mattock or a blunt object, not a pickaxe, was the murder weapon, but the weapon itself was missing. Aumüller's rejection of a pickaxe as a potential murder weapon has been largely ignored in the century since the murders. The lore around the case almost invariably describes the crime as an axe murder or a pickaxe murder. It also put the investigating officers at odds with Aumüller's conclusions. They seem to have focused on a pickaxe as the likely murder weapon immediately. Ownership of the pickaxe in the stable became one of the stranger issues in the investigation. Lorenz Schlittenbauer claimed that the pickaxe belonged to himself, and that Andreas Gruber had stolen it. But George Siegel testified that Andreas Gruber had made that pickaxe. Aumüller determined that Celie had survived for several hours after the initial attacks. She had apparently torn out her own hair as she lay on the stable floor. Aumüller believed that Celie may have actually survived if she had received medical attention in time. There was some initial speculation that due to the variety of wound types, more than one weapon was used. However, the autopsy report has been lost, and so now it's impossible to know. The only surviving documents regarding the autopsy are a coroner's summary and a summary of a phone call between investigator Reingruber and public prosecutor Ferdinand Renner, in which they discussed the autopsy results. Beyond that, information about wound patterns and injury types must be reconstructed from witness statements. Descriptions of the wound patterns indicate that all the victims were wounded on the right side of the head. The male victims had fewer wounds than the female victims. Joseph was hit once, which was enough to kill him outright. Curiously, Andreas was also only hit once, in the area of the right temple and eye, and the existing notes on his wound indicate that this was a crushing, not a cutting blow. We should find this startling. Andreas was arguably the worst threat to the perpetrator. An adult male, even an older man, would have been more difficult to overpower than an adult woman. But Andreas was hit only once, while Victoria, Cecilia, Maria, and even Celie were hit at least twice. Investigators from the local judicial commission, led by Chief Judge Konrad Weissner, arrived at Hinterkaifeck to examine the crime scene and interview witnesses. They entered through the stable door. Andreas and Celie were lying on their backs in a completely straight, stretched-out position and had obviously been moved. In addition to the crushing blows to the skull, Celie's body showed a wide, deep gash at the bottom of the chin. Inside the house, investigators determined that Maria died first, and then Joseph. The bodies in the stable were moved back into the positions they were originally found in, and straw was heaped back over them for the benefit of the crime scene photographer. This was a common practice at the time. A photographer's job was not to record evidence, but to capture images of the overall scene with a view to presenting the images as general visual aids at trial. A crime scene photographer in the 21st century is considered an integral member of an investigative team. They're tasked with preserving, as much as possible, the integrity of physical and visual evidence. But in 1922, the photographer was a professional artist, more accustomed to shooting formal portraits than documenting crime scenes. The commission speculated that the family had been lured into the stable and killed one by one. They tested the acoustics of the stable and the farmhouse to see if the sound of screams would carry from the stable into the living quarters. Judge Weissner went to the various rooms and listened. Those remaining in the stables screamed. Nothing of the screams could be heard in the maid's room or in the living room. Investigators determined that the killer apparently lived in the Gruber house for several days after the murders, and possibly continued to live there for some time after the discovery of the bodies. Investigators found evidence that food, bread and smoked meat, had been recently consumed. According to Hoffner, the mechanic, the Gruber's dog was moved around the property during the time that he spent working in the machine shed, and the machine shed door, which had a broken latch, was so firmly fastened on April 3rd that Hoffner had to remove nails from the door in order to carry out his repairs. The commission also found that tiles had been recently removed from the barn roof, as evidenced by the lack of wear on the tiles underneath the displaced pieces. The location of the missing tiles would have allowed for a person to look down over the courtyard from at least two places. They suspected that the killer used these vantage points to spy on the family and learn their habits in the days leading up to the murders. The pickaxe described by Pohl, Siegel, and Schlittenbauer was still leaning against the feed trough in the stable. Judge Weissner noted that the cattle were licking at it. There were still some traces of blood to be seen on the iron part of this pickaxe, and there was also some red-brown spots on the part of the handle where it leads out of the iron, as if from dried blood. A rope, about the width of a man's finger, hung down from the northern barn attic to the floor. It was tied so tightly at the top that an adult male could let himself down on it. The attics of the house, the stable, and the barn were contiguous. There were dividers and some low walls which served as storage compartments for hay and food and tools, but a person could move from one part of the compound to another within the connected attics without encountering any locked doors and without climbing down to the ground floor of the structure. Curiously, Jacob Siegel claimed that the rope had not been there on April 4th when the bodies were discovered. From his statement, "I was at home that night. The next morning, I had come to the property in Hinterkaifeck where the court commission was already working. When I described my observations made the day before to the judicial commission, I noticed a hay rope in the threshing floor, right by the gates, hanging down from the entablature. I know for sure this rope wasn't there the day before. I know this because we hadn't seen any corpses when we passed through the threshing floor, and I thought they were hanging up somewhere. Because of this, I inspected the threshing floor closely. Even Pohl could not remember the hay rope from the day before." Heinrich Ney, a law clerk who assisted at the crime scene, recalled that as the bodies of the Gruber family were moved back to the threshing floor after being autopsied, he and the men carrying the corpses suddenly noticed a thick hay rope that was not there before. The porters were so frightened that they almost dropped the stretcher and shouted in shock about where this rope was suddenly coming from. "We first thought that someone had let himself down from the hay rope in the meantime, because the rope was hanging down completely taut rather than in a serpentine line. At the top of the dusty crossbeam to which the rope was attached, you could see two handprints. The knot that connected the rope to the crossbeam was tight." Ney informed the police officers on the scene of the rope's sudden presence, and they redeployed their scent dogs. The dogs were unable to pick up a scent trail. If the rope truly was not present as Siegel describes it on April 4th, This could suggest that the killer was still present at Hinterkaifeck during the discovery of the bodies, and used it to climb down and escape through the barn at some point during the early hours of the investigation. Notably, Lorenz Schlittenbauer appears to have spent the night of April 4th through the 5th at Hinterkaifeck, apparently to guard the farm from intruders until the police commission from Munich arrived. He was alone at the crime scene during those hours. Whether he was asleep or awake during that time is unknown. He did not report hearing any noises in the house or barn during that night. The investigative commission noted that Hinterkaifeck was not terribly secure. The courtyard of the farm was fenced in with wire, but is, quote, still freely accessible from the outside because there is a gap a few meters wide in the wire mesh where the oven is located. Because of this gap, the farm property would have been easily and obviously accessible to anyone passing on the road near the bakehouse. April 6th, 1922, Thursday. Mayor George Gregor was put in charge of the Hinterkaifeck estate. He put together a night watch until the presumed heir, Bernard Gruber, arrived. Very little is now known about the people who guarded Hinterkaifeck during these nights. A few men claim to have been part of the official watches, but information from at least one other witness conflicts with their accounts. In 1937, Joseph Thaler told investigators that he was part of the first night watch, together with his brother Andreas and a farmer from Groburn by the name of Joseph. They had spent the night watch on a bench in front of the bakehouse. They weren't in the bakehouse itself. There were no traces of blood or burnt clothing to be seen, according to Thaler. This initial watch took place on the night of April 4th into the morning of April 5th. Thaler went with his father and brother to Hinterkaifeck at around 5 p.m. on April 4th, along with roughly 100 other locals. If Thaler's recall in 1937 is accurate, this would mean he arrived at Hinterkaifeck around the same time as Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Jacob Siegel, and Michael Pohl were breaking down the stable doors. That is, at or just before the time the murders were discovered. Johann Freundl recalled a similar timeline in his 1951 statement. Around 5 p.m., I was informed that everyone in Hinterkaifeck had been slain. My neighbor Stegmeyer informed me of the murder. I immediately went to Hinterkaifeck. We ran across the meadows and fields to the property. Before we got there, we met with the farmers Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel. They had already been to the scene and were on their way home. They told us that everyone was slain. Freundl further recalled entering the Hinterkaifeck house through the front door, and that Schlittenbauer showed us the dead in the barn. Freundl told investigators that he had been assigned to guard the Hinterkaifeck property a few times, and that there were always 3 men on a watch. Another man, Joseph Stratzenstaller, told police in 1951 that he had been part of a night watch at Hinterkaifeck, but couldn't recall the precise dates. He testified that the murders were discovered on April 2nd, 1922. After nearly 30 years, this misremembering of dates is probably to be expected. Joseph was quite familiar with the farmstead because he had worked several seasons there during threshing, and he had been friendly with Carl Gabriel Jr. Joseph was part of the crowd of locals who arrived at Hinterkaifeck when the murders were discovered. He recalled seeing the bodies, but admitted to police that after so many years he could not remember specific details of their wounds, or even which rooms they were found in. He stated that on the night of the discovery, he was part of a group assigned to guard the farm. Alongside me, the farmers Bickler and Kreitmeyer, both of whom lived in Groburn, were assigned to night watch. We stayed mainly in the bakery during the night. We made a fire in the oven to warm up. I would like to point out that the wood we burned was already in the oven. Our night watch lasted until dawn. During the night, we went through the courtyard every now and then. We did not enter the premises. Joseph's concern about the firewood he burned during his watch shift is telling. The wood was considered part of the Gruber estate, an asset for the heirs to handle, and he seemed to want to make sure that the police knew that part of it had been used for legitimate reasons. This further suggests that the night watches were intended to protect the property, not to capture a murderer returning to the scene of the crime. Maria Missel, who worked as a housemaid for Carl Gabriel Sr., reported in 1937 that Joseph Gabriel went to Hinterkaifeck around 6:30 a.m. on April 5th to take care of the livestock. After he returned to Log, the whole Gabriel family went to Hinterkaifeck and drove 5 head of cattle to Log. On the evening of the same day, the sons Joseph and Anton Gabriel went back to the farm. According to Maria, she and Mrs. Gabriel joined the young men there and performed some livestock chores, milking, feeding, and Joseph spent the night alone in the farmhouse. This pattern repeated on April 6th, when Anton joined Joseph in the house overnight. The Gabriel brothers finally left Hinterkaifeck permanently on April 7th. Maria's 1937 statement accounted for nearly every meal, every item carried back and forth, and every trip between Log and Hinterkaifeck in the days after the murders. The level of detail she provided is exceptionally specific. There's no surviving statement from any of the Gabriel family members regarding the night watches or their care of the Hinterkaifeck livestock. The only account of their presence comes from Maria, who assisted in the chores and also recalled helping various members of the Gabriel family to take possession of animals, fodder, and other items from Hinterkaifeck. During at least one of these nights, likely April 4th into April 5th, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was on the Hinterkaifeck property. Which building he occupied or whether anyone else was with him is unknown. Curiously, none of the men who testified to guarding the farm recalled meeting any of the others during their patrols. If Joseph Thaler's account is accurate, he didn't report that anyone occupied the house during his shift. Johann Freundl was only able to provide bare details. Joseph Schratzestaller, despite his apparent confusion about the relevant dates, provided the most specific information and was very careful to note that none of the men assigned to his night watch entered the house. It is possible that several groups of men were on the property at the same time without noticing each other, but that seems a very poor testament to the effectiveness of a watchman. It also appears that the Gabriel family were moving around the property and generally taking charge of the animals, as well as spending nights in the house, but there's no record of them interacting with the watchman assigned to the property. The gaps in the case file are particularly frustrating here. Absent more specific information, it's not possible to know who was on the Hinterkaifeck property in the days immediately following the murders, how they came to be there, or what their purposes were. At least 3 of the men who took part in the night watches were investigated as suspects in the murders. April 7th, 1922. Friday. Inspector Reingruber interviewed a man named Joseph Betz, who was undergoing medical treatment in a Munich hospital. Betz had read newspaper accounts of the murders and claimed he knew who the killer was. During the winter of 1919 to 1920, Betz had worked for an innkeeper at Kosching and shared a room with 3 other men. Among them was a man named Peter Weber. Weber, who was originally from Weidhofen, had found work in the Kosching ammunition plant. During the winter the 2 men roomed together, they often schemed about ways to make money. Weber told Betz he knew of a rich farmer who lived in a remote area and would be easy to rob. Weber was apparently quite convinced that he and Betz could make easy money by killing Andreas Gruber and robbing Hinterkaifeck. He pestered Betz about the plan throughout the winter, although Betz refused to take part in the scheme. Weber appeared to give up on the idea and suggested instead that Betz accompany him to Weidhofen to find work. Weber also suggested that there was good money to be made in black market grain trading there. As far as we know, Betz never followed through. In April of 1920, he moved to Pinings in Swabia. Weber got married around this time and continued to work at the ammunition plant. He also did odd jobs in and around Schrobenhausen and engaged in a little black market trading. Betz claimed that he no longer had any contact with Weber, but he wouldn't be surprised if Weber was involved in the murders. Betz gave Reingruber a physical description of Weber. He's in his 30s, medium height, medium build, bald head, blonde hair, reddish blonde mustache, healthy complexion, round face. In a spurt of vitriol, Betts called Weber a gruesome person, a real whore. April 8th, 1922. Saturday. Officer Karl Flaum of the Mindelheim Police Department interviewed Peter Weber. Weber confirmed some of Betts' story, stating that he had roomed with Betts and 2 other men, including a day laborer from Weidhofen named Anton Bickler. This was the same man who had frightened Kresinck's rider so badly that she had left her job at Hinterkaifeck in 1921. Weber claimed that he had not been in contact with any of his former roommates since the autumn of 1921, when he received a letter from Joseph Betts, which I did not answer. Officer Flaum found that Weber's whereabouts during the days before the murders were very well documented. He was confirmed to have been doing construction work from 8:30 to 5 on March 31st and April 1st, and he was seen at various shops and taverns around Mindelheim on Saturday evening. Witnesses placed him at home on Sunday, April 2nd, and again at work on Monday, April 3rd. Flaum did note that Anton Bickler, not Peter Weber, was known to be dealing in black market dairy products. Police had already questioned Bickler on the basis of Kresinck's statement and released him. There is no further record of Peter Weber in the surviving case files. In Weidhofen, a small funeral was held for the Gruber family and Maria Baumgartner. They were buried side by side in the Weidhofen cemetery. Their heads were not buried with their bodies, because they had been removed and sent to Munich for forensic analysis. Removal of the skulls of murder victims was a standard forensic and legal practice at the time. The skulls would have been examined, cleaned, and preserved for potential display as evidence in a trial. Heinrich Ney told investigators in 1953 that the Gruber's heads were taken to a psychic in Nuremberg, but the clairvoyant could not provide any useful information. The heads were later lost, possibly destroyed by Allied bombings during World War II. We need to address some of the standards of investigation in 1922. We're accustomed to crimes being solved by the use of highly technical scientific methods, and it's easy to forget that these methods are new. It's easy to dismiss past investigators as incompetent. However, the German detectives were working with the tools they had, and those tools were not as primitive as we might think. Laboratories could distinguish human from animal blood. While genetic fingerprinting was decades in the future, blood could be typed, tested for A or B antigens, to eliminate suspects. The antigen test was also used to assist in determining questioned paternity. It couldn't definitively identify a potential donor of genetic material, but it could at least be used to exclude suspected donors. Fecal matter was also studied. It was routinely sampled during autopsies. Along with stomach contents, fecal matter could help determine the interval between a victim's last meal and their death, which could in turn narrow down a time range since death in homicide cases. At Hinterkaifeck, investigators found human feces in the stables that they believed belonged to the murderer. Standard procedure would have involved collecting these for analysis in case the presence of parasites, ova, or other abnormal constituents could be matched to those found in the feces of a suspect. Whether the fecal material found at Hinterkaifeck was actually collected for analysis is unknown. At least there are no surviving records of this. Fingerprinting was well known in 1922. By 1901, the practice was standard in England, and fingerprinting was widely adopted in the United States by 1902. The suspected weapons found at Hinterkaifeck during the 1923 demolition were subjected to fingerprint analysis, but no useful prints were found. German police had also begun a collection of criminal files based on the working methods of known criminals. By 1915, it included dossiers on thieves and housebreakers obtained from prisons, newspapers, and police officials all over Germany. They had also begun compiling similar files for other crimes. This centralized file system allowed detectives to search for suspects based on behaviors specific to their modus operandi, rather than searching through fingerprint cards or depending on witness identification. A host of other tools were available to forensic investigators in 1922, including soil and water analysis, hemoglobin tests for the presence of blood in areas that had been cleaned, microscopic comparison of hair and fibers, tool mark analysis, and evidence preservation and recording through plaster casting and photography. We know that the Grubers' bodies were examined for weapon marks, and the scenes were photographed. But detectives cannot collect evidence that does not exist. Forensic scientists cannot analyze what is not there. The case was plagued by an overall absence of physical evidence. Next time, on Long Cold Dark, we'll look at the evidence that was found and see if it can tell us anything useful. I'm C.S. Frank. Thanks for listening.